Okay, thank you for coming. We are up to the second chapter of Hallel, chapter 114 in Tehillim. Fairly short chapter, only 8 verses, so we're going to go through it tonight together. In the second chapter of Hallel, a relatively same theme as the first chapter of Hallel. It's praises of Hashem and focusing on the times of Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus, Kriyas Yamsuf, splitting of the sea, and Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah. This chapter 114, B'tzeis Yisrael Mitzrayim, it's a very famous chapter. We sing it quite often. When we do say Hallel, it's one of the more famous chapters of Hallel, and very poetic, very vivid descriptions, fantastical descriptions, as we're going to see, and it really does quite easily align with various parts of the story of, again, the Exodus, the splitting of the sea, and the giving of the Torah, but it's praising Hashem for those times. So let's jump right into it. B'tzeis Yisrael mitzrayim, Beis Yaakov me'am loyez. When the Jewish people went forth from Egypt, Beis Yaakov, the house of Jacob, me'am loyez, from a people of strange language. Right away, interesting statement. Obviously, this is referring to Yetzias Mitzrayim, the actual Exodus itself, before even Kriyas Yamsuf, and the first 2 verses are really going to be about that. But the statement that the Jewish people left from a people of a strange language is a little bit odd, because you'd think that the Jewish people, after living in Egypt for 210 years, would have adapted to the language of Egypt. Certainly, someone living in a country for that time, just to get by, would pick up the language. And if they were really interacting, unfortunately, they were forced to interact with the Egyptians. And you'd think that they would, again, have picked up the language. So why is it called me'am loyez, from a foreign or strange speech? But we know, our sages tell us, that the Jewish people left Egypt in the merit of 3 things. Shalishinu es shmaisam, they didn't change their names. Lishinu es lashonam, they didn't change their language. There's seems to be different versions about the third thing they didn't change, whether it was malbusham, their clothing, their mode of dress, or that they didn't, doesn't fit with the whole structure, but they didn't fall prey to arayas, they didn't make mistakes in immorality. We're going to see in a second, to interpret at least this chapter of Tehillim, the explanation that it's that they didn't fall prey to immorality, but at least just going back to language, one of the things that our sages tell us that they did stay distinct from the Egyptians with was language, that they maintained their Jewish language, and they were speaking Hebrew, Lashon HaKodesh, even though Egypt all around them was speaking Mitzrayim, and it would have been natural for them to adapt or adopt that native tongue in the country they were living in. They didn't do that. They stayed true to their language, and in that merit, one of the things that they had as a merit was that, and they were able to leave Egypt. Still, that doesn't mean that nobody spoke Egyptian. Just simply, you could say that there were some, perhaps everyone who spoke Egyptian, but they maintained at home, or at least as their native tongue, they maintained Hebrew. There are some commentators who say that the fact that it says me'am loez, a strange speech, actually implies that there were people who did not speak Egyptian at all, which they say might be Shevet Levi. It also might be the woman. It could be that Shevet Levi, because they didn't have to go out and work. We know that they had that gift that Moshe set up. Really, that Yosef set up, that the priests, which Levi was the tribe of priests, didn't have to work. So that's why Moshe was able to come and go from Paro. So perhaps because they didn't have to work, they didn't have to integrate into the Egyptian society, they didn't have to speak Egyptian. So it could be they were the ones that maintained the purity of the Hebrew language. But also the word Beis Yaakov, we know, is very often used to refer specifically to the women of the Jewish people. So perhaps the Beis Yaakov here, me'am loez, means that the women who were more in the home and less interacting with the Egyptians, they were the ones who maintained the authenticity of the Hebrew language, and they might not have not at all known any Egyptian. That could quite be, and in their merit, the Jewish people were able to leave Israel. But continuing on this idea that in those 3 things were the things that the Jewish people merited to leave Egypt with, and they didn't change their names, their language, and they didn't fall prey to immorality, we can actually read these into the first 2 verses. So, B'tzeis Yisrael Mitzrayim, when the Jewish people left Mitzrayim, Yisrael is a name that's used for the Jewish people. It could be that that's actually the stress here, that when they left, they were Yisrael. They left with their Jewish names. That's what enabled them to be able to leave. And Beis Yaakov me'am loyez, also because they maintained the fact that Egyptian, at least to some of them, maybe to all of them, was a foreign speech, and they maintained their Hebrew language. And then Pasuk Beis, Haisa Yehuda leKadshay Yisrael Mam Shalosav. That this pasuk means that Yehuda became his holy one and Yisrael his dominion. So this also could refer to some form of remaining free from immorality. The Jewish people were Hashem's, and they were his holy ones, and they were his dominion, meaning that they did not get involved in the immorality of Egypt at all. Okay, moving on to Pasuk Beis. Haisa Yehuda lekadra Yisrael mam shleisav also probably refers specifically to Kriyas Yamsuf, and the next verse will as well. Why would this pasuk refer to Kriyas Yamsuf? Because two reasons. Number one, there's a specific focus on Yehuda. Yehuda, as we know, was the shevet of the Malchus, of the kingdom, of the kingship. They were the leaders of the Jewish people, and they showed that, they demonstrated it at Kriyas Yamsuf, because Yehuda, the leader of Yehuda, Nachshon ben Aminadav, who was the Nasi of Shevet Yehuda, the prince of the tribe of Judah, he was the one to first go into the waters of the Yamsuf before it had even split. He went up to his nostrils, and when it was looking like he was going to drown, that's when God caused the waters to split, and the Jewish people were saved. So Yehuda became the Holy One of Hashem, displayed his right to the kingship at that moment, and that's when they became the Jewish people became the chosen nation of Hashem. And also, that could be Yisrael Mam Shalosav. Again, they became the nation of Hashem. Sages tell us that really until Kriyas Yamsuf, until the splitting of the sea, the Jewish people were not fully freed from the dominion, from the control of Egyptians. Even though most of the Egyptians were dead, but they were still pursuing them, power was still alive, they still had the fear, and they felt like the slaves of the Egyptians up until that moment of Kriyas Yamsuf. And then that's when they were able to transition from being the slaves of Paro to being the servants of Hashem. So that's when Yisrael Mam Shalosav, the Jewish people, became the dominion of Hashem. The word Haisa grammatically is strange because Haisa is Nekeva, it's feminine, and everyone in this pasuk is Zachar, is male, so it should be Hayu Yehuda, not Haisa. However, the commentators explain that this was like a moment of a wedding. It was the union between Hashem and the Jewish people, and in that relationship, so Hashem is the masculine, the giver, and the Jewish people are the feminine, the receiver. So that's why it's Haisa Yehuda lekadra, expressed in the feminine form. Pasuk Gimel. Hayam Ra'av Vayanus Hayarden Yisayv La'achar. So Hayam Ra'av Vayanus, the sea saw them and fled. Hayarden Yisayv La'achar, the Jordan River turned back. Obviously referring to Kriyas Yamsuf. And the two main questions. First, we have to figure out Hayam Ra'a, the sea saw and it split. What did it see? Two explanations. One is that it saw the staff of Moshe. Moshe raised up the staff at Hashem's command. Hashem's name was engraved into the staff. The sea saw that, and that's what caused it to split out of fear and respect for the name of Hashem, who had commanded it to. The other explanation, very famously, the Medrash Rabbah says that it saw the Aron of Yosef. It saw the Ark of Yosef, Hatzadik, that Moshe had brought with, and the Jewish people had lifted up. Moshe had lifted up from the river in Egypt and from the Nile River, and they brought with him that Aron. And when the sea saw that, that's what caused it to split. The idea, the message being that the sea didn't want to deviate from its normal course of action. It felt that's inappropriate. I'm not supposed to do that. That's not what Hashem wants me to do. But when it saw the Aron of Yosef, and it realized, well, Yosef deviated from his normal course of action because natural tendency of a person will be to succumb to temptation. And Yosef went against that natural tendency and resisted the advances of Potiphar's wife. So the sea said, if he could do that, I can do the same and I can split. Hayarden Yisrael La'achar, the second question is, what does that have to do with anything? Where does the Jordan River come into this? There are some who say, well, the Jordan River meant at the time of Kriyas Yamsuf, the Jordan River also split, because our sages tell us that at the time of Kriyas Yamsuf, all waters in the world were also divided. But the Malbim and others say, no, it actually refers to the Jordan River splitting at the time of Yehoshua, after Moshe's death, after the Torah, in the book of Yehoshua, when the Jewish people finally cross over into Eretz Yisrael. So the Jordan River has to split for them as well. There's a whole procedure there with the Ark and the Kohanim. It's done in a very specific way. The Malbim says, by the way, notice that Hayam Ra'a Vayanus, the sea saw and Vayanus, it fled, which means that both sides fled apart from each other. It split. By the Yarden, by the Jordan River, it doesn't say that. It uses a different word. It says Yisayv La'achar, it ran backwards. And the reason is because a sea, which is just stationary, has to split to allow the Jewish people to get through. It has to move to each side. Whereas the river, which is flowing, really what happened is it was flowing and suddenly it stopped. All the water kept going, and the water that was coming hit that break and began to pile up behind it. And that's the imagery of it ran backwards. So it's a different form of splitting. We'll come back to that later in the final verse as well. Pasuk Dalet, the fourth pasuk, now goes on to Matan Torah. Heharim raktu ke'elim, the mountains skipped like rams. Givais kivnei tzon, and the hills like sheep. This refers to Matan Torah. All the mountains and hills of the world gathered around Har Sinai. They trembled in awe from Hashem, from the revelation of godliness, and they skipped and they danced because the world, with the evolution of the Jewish people, who had now accepted upon themselves the Torah and had really justified the existence of the entire world, the world became filled with a new energy at that moment, the elevation of the Jewish people. So at that moment, the hills and the mountains started dancing and singing, and that's the imagery we have. The mountains are like rams because they're big and sharp and pointy, and the geva'os, the hills, which are more low and curved, those are kivnei tzon, they're more gentle, like the lambs, as opposed to the rams. Pasuk 5. So, in this pasuk, the author of Tehillim captures the sense of awe and bewilderment that seized all of mankind at the time of Kriyas Yamsuf and Matan Torah, because our sages tell us that everyone knew about it, everyone was affected, and they called out, Malach ahayam kisanus. What is going on? What alarms you, the sea, that you flee? Hayard and Tisar the Achar, the Jordan, that you run backwards. And then Pasuk 6 as well, continuing this question, Heharim tiktu che'elim, the mountains that you're skipping like rams, Gevos kivnei tzon, the hills like sheep. So verses 5 and 6 are really just repeating verses 3 and 4. And the phenomena that are described in 3 and 4 as happening now in 5 and 6, it says, well, the nations of the world, everyone at the time saw all of those events and wondered what in the world is happening, what is going on here. And the answer is presented in verse 7, Milifnei Adon Chulei Aretz, the earth is trembling at the presence of Hashem, Milifnei Elokei Yaakov, at the presence of the God of Jacob. Now, the earth is not any of the things previously described, the mountains, the sea, the Jordan, but most likely the Radak says simply it's just, it's inclusive. The earth includes the mountains and the sea and the river, so it answers for all of them. It's also a medrash that Moshe asked these questions. He asked the sea, why do you split? Why do you fear? And it said, ask the river. He asked the river said, ask the mountains. He asked the mountains said, ask the earth. And the earth answered, I'm trembling before Hashem, not before Moshe, but before Hashem. There's actually an interesting commentary from a commentator called the Mahari Sagis. He says that the final words of this pasuk, Melifnei Eloka Yaakov, that I'm trembling before the presence of the God of Jacob. Where did the God of Jacob come into the picture? Why is Hashem being referred to in that way? So he says that this refers to the Jordan River specifically, because as we said, the Jordan River didn't split, it just kind of piled up, which is considered maybe a lesser form of reaction. It didn't run away, it just piled up to allow the Jewish people to cross. And again, we said from the Malbim a simple explanation because that's what's necessary. It wasn't an ocean that had to split. It was just a river that had to let the water keep going and stop the water from coming. But the Mahari Sagis says the reason why the Jordan River only reacted that way was because it was fleeing from the God of Jacob, meaning that the Jordan River, actually had split once before when Yaakov needed to cross it way back in Sefer Bereshis. So because of that, says the Mahari Sagis, it was kind of more used to this experience. It wasn't as afraid, so it only had to, turn around backwards and do that pileup. It didn't have to do a full splitting because it already knew the God of Jacob. Finally, the last pasuk, he turns the rock into a pool of water and the flinty rock into a fountain of water. This the first half of the pasuk, most simply refers to when Moshe hit the rock in Shmos. Remember, Moshe hit the rock twice. The first time he was supposed to, second time he wasn't supposed to. The first time, which is in the book of Shmos, Moshe hits the rock and water comes forth miraculously, and that's what's being described in the first half of the pasuk. And Chalamish l'mayim mayim, according to the commentators, refers to the coming of Mashiach, when the flinty rock, meaning the entire world, will be filled as if with a fountain. L'mayim mayim, as Chazal describes, as the pasuk describes, that the earth will be filled with awareness of Hashem, just like the water covers over the sea. Okay? That's all. Thanks for coming.